Hi everybody, my name is Rala Mintz-Geffen, and I'm going to talk to you today a bit about a piece of the Jewish family, a piece of all families in all societies, and that is the grandparenting generation, and what the role of grandparents is in America and in the Jewish community. And it also, of course, may differ around the world in different Jewish communities, because in every place in the world, the Jews are also influenced by the context, the society in which they live. And I study life cycle in general, and I've been doing that for more than 40 years. However, I tend to focus on whatever life cycle stage I'm in. So I spent 20 years studying dual career families. I spent a long time studying Jewish women on the way up, which covers a number of life cycle stages. And for the last 13 years, believe it or not, 13 years, I've been a grandparent. And I discovered, when I started looking into grandparenting, that there is absolutely nothing written in American sociology or in sociology of the Jews, at least in America, about grandparents. American sociology in general has been very focused on what was known in the time of Talcott Parsons and Robert Merton as the isolated nuclear family. And the extended family was pretty much left alone once Jews passed the immigrant period and Americans in general stopped living together in the same households. If you weren't in the same household, you were excluded from studies. So we have, for example, from the 70s and 80s and 90s of the previous century, we have a lot of studies of how roles changed between spouses, internal to households, or between parents and children. Who took out the garbage, who earned more money, and if that made a difference in the power in the system, what happened when it became a gay couple, all of this, what happened with divorce. Nobody ever mentioned the grandparents. I went looking for resources on it because I decided I wanted to find out more about Jewish grandparenting. Well, or Jews who are grandparents. And it turns out that the only books or articles that have been written that even mention grandparents are books about how to utilize grandparents or how grandparents should react in the case of interfaith marriage of their children. But other than that, we have zero. Well, now one article that I've written, which should be up on a website for you to see very shortly. So let me talk a bit about grandparenting, why I think it's important, and what kinds of things I'm looking at in terms of the relationships of Jews with their extended family. That is, the nuclear family is parents and children, 2 generations in one household. By the way, I should say there is one case, just as in Judaism, the case of the interfaith has been dealt with, partially. In American sociological studies, the only case in which grandparents are mentioned, and which 90% of the studies are about, and I've seen abstracts of all of them since 1970. All the studies from sociological journals, social psychological, family studies, all of them, social work, have to do with grandparents who are in loco parentis. That is, grandparents who are actually raising their grandchildren. And the American government gives out grants for that. Whatever there's money to study gets studied. And so that's the only aspect of grandparenting. And what I'm interested in is the role of grandparents in transmitting Jewish identity, jumping a generation. Whether they do it consciously or not, whether they can report on what's happened, whether if they have different sets of grandparents with different children, they're different. And so I decided to try to explore this unexplored field, and I figured that anything I did would be a contribution, since there is nothing, zip. Try looking it up and you'll see what you can find. Now, I'm also interested in the rest of the extended family, aunts and uncles and cousins, but I had to start someplace. So I decided to start with grandparents and to do in-depth interviews. And here are a few things that I've learned so far. By the way, the first thing that I ask in my survey, which I've done mostly as in-person, face-to-face interviews, is what they're called. Because you always have to start with something that's easy and people feel comfortable with, and they'll start talking to you. And I ask what they're called, if different grandchildren call them by different names, and also who picked the name. And it turns out that it's a very interesting discussion. So you can yourselves in your class ask yourselves, do you have a Nana? Do you have a grandma? Do you have an Oma? If you're of German descent, Jewish descent, do you have a Savta? Savta, for instance. Do they call different grandparents different things? In Israel, they have a big problem because if most of the grandmothers are Savtas, so or most of the grandfathers are Sabas, so they use the first name with it, like Savta Sarah, Savta Ruthie, to distinguish, because it's a problem distinguishing them. Now, for a long time, Jews in America didn't have very many grandparents around. There was the immigrant generation, the number of immigrant generations, where the grandparents were across the sea. And once you were gone, you were gone. I mean, if you got a letter once a month, that was a very big deal. And you rarely saw them again. Then we went through the Shoah period, where many people lost that older generation of their family because they had never moved. And they didn't come to America, and now they were really gone. And there were many immigrants, Jewish immigrants, who came to America after the Shoah, and they were the few remainders of what was left of those extended families. And so they set about creating new generations of Jewish families. That was what was so amazing, that they didn't give up on life. They started all over again. But there were a lot of grandparents missing. Then we went through a generation in the mid-20th century, the mid to the, let's say from 1960 to almost the end, where instead of the children growing up and moving away, the grandparents moved. And they usually moved to places that were good for retirement or their health, like Arizona if they had arthritis, or Florida if they liked to play golf. And now we have something very new. We have a different situation. We have, first of all, according to the United States Census, I think it's by the year 2017, but I have it correct in the article that you're going to read. More than half of all American families are going to have 4 generations alive at the same time. So people talk about the sandwich generation, that the middle generation is taking care of children who are still dependent and their parents who have become dependent. Now we have what I call the double-decker sandwich generation, and we see something very interesting. People, and Irish Eskin, who's a demographer, has actually picked up, you can see it now in the numbers, people moving the very oldest generation, who were the great-grandparents, back to live from Florida and Arizona. They're the ones who moved back to live near some member of the family who is in, it could be in the 3rd generation or the 2nd, it could be a grandchild, or it could be one of their children, so that there will be somebody near them to help take care of them, because they're now in their 80s, moving into their 90s. And we're going to see more and more of this. And the other thing is that the grandparents grow up and move away has changed, and there's a marked trend toward they're either aging in place and moving, selling their houses and moving, or getting stair rides so they don't have a problem from the stairs, or if they move, they decide where to move, not based on their health or golf, or a trend of building senior citizen communities in Florida, which was very big for a long time. Now what they do is they move to live near one of their children who seems to be permanently settled and who has children themselves. And therefore they can be very influential, I think. Well, I don't know. There's all kinds of urban legends about how powerful grandparents are. We really don't know. Nobody has looked at it at all, as I pointed out before. But the urban legend is that grandparents can have a tremendous impact on their grandchildren. My sister, who I always love to quote, says that there's a natural affinity between grandparents and grandchildren because they have a common enemy, the parents. That's one of her better sayings. May or may not be true, but the internet has also changed things a lot, even if they don't live near each other. First it was inexpensive phone calls, but then you still have the hearing issues and so forth, and time of day. But with the internet, and the fastest growing group on the internet is seniors, by the way. That's an American statistic. They can communicate all the time, and they do. And it's a terrific thing. So what I'm trying to find out now is what is the relationship, or what are the types of relationships that grandparents have with their grandchildren? Do they consciously try to transmit identity? How do they want to be remembered? It's a very hard thing to ask people. What do they think makes an ideal grandparent? What they would like the relationship to be? And then I'm trying to find all the different ways in which they relate to their grandchildren. Do they pay for trips to Israel? Jewish things and general things. Do they make the holiday celebrations? All the different kinds of things that you might think of. Do they talk to their grandchildren? Do they take them on trips? There seems to be a custom in a growing number of Jewish families now, which is that around the time of bar mitzvah, or maybe sweet 16, but really around bar mitzvah, that the grandparents take that child on some kind of a trip. The child has some say in what it is, and the grandparents do. And they try to do things with individual grandchildren too, so they have special things with each one. Sometimes they pay for synagogue dues, or Jewish summer camp, or daycare, and they help them that way. The parents don't like to take money generally, but they'll take it for the children. There's appeared to be very strong and growing stronger relationships between grandparents and grandchildren. Now, the catch in all of this is that Jews tend to marry later than people who are not Jewish in the United States, and have fewer children. But about the same as the general birth rate in America, but it's below what's called ZPG, zero population growth, or replacement level. And so there aren't so many grandchildren as maybe there used to be, but there's more opportunity to relate to them in different ways. I would be very interested if any of you decided for this particular course, even though I'm not the teacher, to do a paper on grandparenting. I've had a couple of graduate students who have either asked grandparents what they think their roles are, or asked college-age grandchildren, what they would like their grandparents to be, or what their relationships are. Because you've got to look at it from the perspective of the different generations. And I also discovered that there are some people, and I asked people how they learned to be a grandparent. There's no defined role for a grandparent in America. That's another problem. There are tribes and whole civilizations where grandparents have very specific roles. And it's even different in different Jewish communities. In Israel, grandparents have much more defined roles than they do in America. For example, one of the big problems in Israel, I see it as a problem anyway, is that the school day is very short, and for elementary school, most of them get out at 1 o'clock and come home for a main meal of the day. And in most households, both spouses are out working. Who picks them up? Who gives them the main meal of the day? Who watches them? I was once in Israel for the whole month of August. There's nothing for children in August in Israel. Their camps, which they call kaitana, are mainly in July. Somebody had an open house for me. I don't know, maybe 30 people came, but the 20 people who didn't come, their main excuse was it was August. They were totally exhausted from taking care of their grandchildren. And they really were. They really were. But as each one walked out the door that night, I made them answer one of my short questions that's, complete the thought. The best thing about being a grandparent is, and the hardest thing or the worst thing about being a grandparent is. I wouldn't let them out of the room unless they answered that question. By the way, the hardest thing about being a grandparent so far is watching my children handling the grandchildren differently than I would. Or sometimes they just say, keeping my mouth shut. It's one of my favorite answers. By the way, I'm doing grandfathers and grandmothers. So grandparenting is a very important life cycle stage. Grandparents are living longer. They are healthier. They are more likely to be in communication. They have fewer grandchildren than their parents may have had to relate to, and maybe a little more time to spend on each one. And I think they're a very important influence in children's lives. And so I hope you'll think about this issue and maybe have a talk in your class about your relationships to grandparents, or maybe in the forum. Is this an online course? Maybe you'll have a talk in the forum about what you think grandparents might be or what they have been in your life. By the way, I also discovered people who, when I asked them how they learned to be a grandparent, they said they couldn't stand their grandparents and they became the opposite. So it's not always a positive thing. And at least I've stopped getting the stereotype thing, which is for the grandfather, I sat next to him in shul, played with his tzitzit, that kind of thing. I cooked with my grandmother. You still get that to some extent. But I'm trying to dig a little deeper and get more information. So if any of you see this and you want to write to me on email about your experience as grandchildren or as parents or as grandparents relating to the older generation, that's another thing that's not so easy, being the enemies in the middle. I'd be interested in hearing it. My email address is rela1, R-E-L-A, and the numeral 1 at AOL.com. Well, it's been lovely speaking to you today.